there! My name is Dr. Buckley, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to our first lecture video of this course. So in this introductory video, I'm going to talk about kind of the history of memory science and how it evolved over the years, and also provide some background info as far as how psychological scientists study memory. So I thought maybe an interesting or cool way to start our conversation about memory would be to consider how memory is typically represented in pop culture, right? So I'm sure all of you are familiar with certain movies that talk a lot about memory. So I want you to kind of think to yourself, what movies have you seen that make reference to memory in some way? So I'll give you some examples from my generation. So I was born in 1987. So all of my movie references are from around that time. Are things maybe you haven't heard of. So the first movie for me that comes to mind is the 1990s Arnold Schwarzenegger film called Total Recall. And so basically, in this kind of dystopian movie, Arnold Schwarzenegger tries to buy fake memories of a trip to Mars, only to discover that his actual memories have been erased and that the whole sort of essence of his life has been a lie. And of course, maybe a lot of you are familiar with the Matrix trilogy, right? So the original Matrix film that was made in 1999 follows a main character who discovers that basically all of his memories have been generated by a computer, and all of the people on Earth in this film were basically in a coma, and their entire consciousness was artificially generated, right? And then the last one, which is a personal favorite of mine, is the 2004 film with Jim Carrey called The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And so basically, in this sort of sci-fi thriller, Jim Carrey is heartbroken over an unrequited love between him and a woman. And he decides to kind of uh, uh, to escape his heartbreak by having his memories erased. Um, and so all of these movies, believe it or not, even though they are sci-fi, they do have some kind of nuggets of truth embedded in their plot lines. So Total Recall illustrates how integral our memories are to our experience of self, right? So if our memories are altered in some way, that can fundamentally change how we see ourselves and how we experience the world, right? And the eternal sunshine of the spotless mind, it actually illuminates some true phenomena. So one of the main psychological functions of forgetting, right, is that it allows us to edit our memories, right? So forgetting allows us to prevent ourselves from being bombarded with information that's no longer relevant or useful to us. And forgetting also preserves kind of our sense of self and our sense of psychological well-being by making memories that are traumatic or distressing less accessible over time, right? So yeah. So one of the things that it's important for us to get a sense of, right, if we're going to talk about memory, is kind of what memory is, right? So there are many different meanings to the word memory, and they all have different contexts. So for example, the term memory can refer to the use of a past experience on current behavior, right? So for example, you can say that you used your memory of how to read in order to interpret the words on this slide. Memory can also refer to a body of knowledge. So you can say that in essence, your memory is the sum of all the facts and experiences that you can recall. We can also talk about memory as an ability. So you can say that you have the ability to encode, store, and retrieve information. And we can all agree, given our sophisticated understanding of neural connections and the brain, right, that memories really are neural connections that are forged in the brain every time we have an experience. Right. So, for example, there was a very famous study several years ago that looked at the number of neural connections in the hippocampus and surrounding cortical areas of rats. And they found that when rats were in cages where they had access to toys and other kinds of stimulating activities, and also when they were placed in cages with other rats from the time they were young, they had far more proliferation of neural connections than rats that were raised in kind of dim or unstimulating environments, or rats that were raised by themselves, right? So a memory can be simply evidence that a past experience has influenced your behavior. It can refer to a body of knowledge that you have, or all of your accumulated facts and experiences. It can refer to specific cognitive processes like the storing of those experiences, the encoding, which is simply getting information into your memory storage system, and retrieving information. And we can also talk about memory as neural connections forged as a result of experience. Okay. So, one important distinction to make is a distinction between learning and memory, right? Because these terms are often used interchangeably, right? But there's actually a pretty significant distinction between them. So, when we talk about learning, in essence, we're talking about an action that leads to the creation of an internal representation or memory, right? So, learning is any action that you perform or any behavior that facilitates the acquisition of new information, right? So, learning would be listening to a lecture and taking notes, right? Or learning would be observing the behavior of other people and its consequences, right? So, learning is any behavior that allows you to acquire new information in the form of an internal representation that you can then store in your memory. Memory, on the other hand, is a record of learning or the evidence that you have learned something, right? So a good example would be a person uses learning in the form of experience to acquire a language, right? So a baby listens to his parents as they speak to each other and as they speak to him. And those experiences, those learning experiences, okay, create mental representations that are then stored in memory, right? So a person uses learning to acquire something like language, but uses memory to recall the rules and vocabulary that the learning experience provided, in essence, right? So learning is behavior to that leads to the acquisition of new information, and memory is the storage system or record of that learning where those mental representations come from. So, for example, something like literacy, right? We have spent years and years and years as little infants and toddlers and elementary school students learning how to read, right? And now that we have devoted all of that time and energy through those learning activities, we have acquisitions, mental representations that we can access through our memory for things like vocabulary, for pronunciation of words, for phonemes and morphemes and syllables, right? And we also know, for example, the difference between literal phrases and abstract phrases like sarcasm, right? So memories are essentially the evidence or the acclamation of that learned information. So the topic of memory is as old as recorded history in the Western world. So both the Egyptians and Greeks had deities devoted to memory. So in ancient Egypt, Thoth was the god of memory, wisdom, and knowledge, and was usually depicted as the head of an ibis and the body of a man holding tools like a scribe, right? So Thoth was a very high ranking god and was given credit for authoring important works of science, religion, philosophy, astronomy, astrology, mathematics, medicine, theology, and oration. So the high status of Thoth and the vast array of intellectual accomplishments attributed to him implies that the Egyptians in particular saw memory as a fundamental to all aspects of intellectual life. And in ancient Greece, we see the same thing. So their goddess of memory was Mnemosyne, and the name of this Greek god was actually where we got the word mnemonic. And by the way, amnesia is a word that also comes from ancient Greek. So, like Thoth, the Greek god of memory was essentially a muse who had specialized skills for poetry, history, music, hymns, dance, comedy, things like that. So why am I telling you this? Well, I'm trying to give you kind of a a historical overview of how memory science was an important component of our society, even in our very, very early days or in ancient times, if you will. So another great example is theories of Plato and Aristotle in ancient Greece. So the earliest known theories of memory that attempted to explain how memory operates were put forth by both Plato and Aristotle between the years of about 384 and 322 BCE. So they were two great philosophers whose ideas would inspire great thinkers and scientists yet to come. So Plato used, in particular, metaphors to describe memory. So his best known memory metaphor was a wax tablet. So basically, Plato argued that memories were encoded or stored like words carved onto a wax tablet, and whether a memory was accessible later depended on how soft the tablet was and how deeply the words were carved in the wax. So, one of the things that was interesting about Plato is that he was a rationalist and believed that knowledge came from reason and not from observation, which made memory unknowable. In contrast, Aristotle had very different views. So he was an empiricist and argued that it was possible to gain knowledge only from observation. And so Aristotle was critical in developing a rudimentary scientific method, and he used it to put forth some basic ideas about memory. So, for example, he had a work called On Memory and Reminiscence. And basically, he argued that memories are triggered by association, and that thinking about a given concept causes the recollection of all things associated with that concept. So Aristotle's idea of associations would be proven true by a lot of early memory scientists, including Hermann Ebbinghaus, who is basically the father of contemporary memory science. And he also accurately made a lot of the distinctions between different types of memory that we'll talk about. So, for example, we have long term memories that are either implicit or explicit, and we have long term memories that are either semantic or episodic. So, we'll talk about those things. And these were all things that Aristotle wrote about in his very early treatise on memory. So, even very sophisticated contemporary ideas about the psychology and neuroscience of memory predated as far back as ancient times. So, one of the things that we get from the Greeks that is still very much relevant today is something called the method of loci. So in Greco-Roman times, public figures were trained in oration and rhetoric, and they were expected to learn and deliver really long and complex speeches and poetry with perfect accuracy. So the work of Cicero shows that the Greeks and Romans understood memory well enough to develop their own mnemonic or memory aid devices, and one of the most popular ones was called the method of loci. Um, so all of the descriptions of this method of loci basically broke it down into 3 steps. So first, if you want to implement the method of loci according to the Roman Greek tradition, you would create a mental image of a great house containing a variety of objects in connected rooms, and you would basically memorize a fixed path throughout this house. Okay, so after you conjure up a mental image of this great house with interconnected rooms and objects in each room, the second step was to associate the first item you wanted to remember with the first location in the house, the second item with the second location, and so on. And then finally, you would engage in what we call rehearsal, where you go through all of the items that you want to recall in the house. So you would simply imagine kind of walking down this set path. And essentially, what Cicero hypothesized is that the method of loci is effective because memory is closely linked to time and order, and vision is the most powerful of all the senses. And we now know that that hypothesis, first posited by Cicero, is actually basically correct. So the reason why the method of loci is so effective is because it uses a well-learned pathway that we're all familiar with. And it also uses vision, which is very much interconnected with memory. So, for example, if this was your house and you were trying to memorize a grocery list, right, you would imagine walking through the door, and maybe right outside or right in front of your door, you have a table. So you would imagine maybe a table, and with instead of legs on it, you have bananas, right? So the table is made up of bananas. And then you would walk into the first room. If the second word on your grocery list was bleach, okay, you might imagine if the first room you walk in is the bathroom, you might imagine the bathtub being filled with bleach or something like that. So the method of loci gives you these very, very rich, vivid mental images and you associate those mental images with the to be remembered items. Right? So we'll talk more about the method of loci, but I basically just wanted to illustrate that a lot of these fundamental concepts that we're going to talk about are traceable all the way back to very, very early in our history as a civilization. Okay, so I've already mentioned this a little bit, but ancient Greeks in the empiricist traditions such as Aristotle, right? They believed in the empiricist tradition, which is essentially that sensory experience is the only source of what we know. And they also were subscribed to an associationist doctrine, which was basically that memory of any sensory event is associated with memory of other sensory events, right? So we can very easily create associations between different memories. And so, for example, if we've associated sensory event A with sensory event B, retrieval of that first event, event A, often leads to successful recall of event B, right? Um, so not only did they subscribe to the view that memories are associated with each other and derived from sensory experience, but they also sort of pontificated about factors that might affect those associations, such as frequency of the sensory experience, how often it happened, duration, how long it lasted, whether event A and event B are similar to each other in terms of their sensory properties or distinctive, how interested the observer was in the sensory events, and so on. So one disadvantage, right, of the philosophical tradition is that it's all very passive, right? So we're not actually doing any sort of scientific experimentation to test these hypotheses, right? Um, so that's the benefit of psychology, right? So a lot of early experimental psychologists were philosophers by training that wanted to add the precision of for example, physiology or biology or chemistry to the study of the mind, right? So a lot of modern memory research grew from very early traditions in experimental psychology. So a lot of the early experimental psychologists were psychophysicists, right? So psychophysicists would, in essence, study perception of sensory stimuli, right? So, for example, um, a person would watch a ball hit a platform, right? And they would have to indicate when they perceived the sound, okay? Um, when they first perceived the sound. Or they would listen to a scale on a piano and they would have to indicate whether they heard all the notes at once when the scale was played or each note individually, right? So those were the kinds of things that psychophysicists were interested in, is how the mind kind of breaks down the most basic elements of experience. And they emphasized things like measurement error, right? So everything had to be very, very precise in order to understand the basic properties of mental life, basically. And they also emphasized getting many, many, many different observations. So they would often do many, many, many trials of hitting that ball against the platform and compare all of them together. So they were very much of the mind that we need many, many observations to be as precise as possible. And finally, they were one of the first scientists to emphasize sampling error. So sampling error is just when we have observations that occur by chance alone, but don't actually reflect true differences, right? So all of this is to say that early memory research was kind of dually influenced by both the philosophic tradition and the psychophysics tradition that emphasized very precise measurement, reduction of measurement error, things like that. Okay, so here I have kind of a breakdown of all of the critical events that occurred in the history of early memory research, right? So everything starts with Ebbinghaus. Hermann Ebbinghaus is essentially the father of modern day memory science. So we'll talk about him in just a moment. And then we'll talk about the verbal learning approach, which coincided with the behaviorist movement in psychology. We'll talk briefly about Gestalt psychology, and then we'll talk about more applied memory traditions. So the study of how culture influences memory. And finally, we'll talk about the information processing approach and the cognitive revolution. Okay, so Hermann Ebbinghaus was really fascinated by memory. And in particular, he wanted to find a way to quantify two different processes that a lot of people think of as being on opposite sides of a spectrum, right? So he wanted to quantify what we remember, okay? So he wanted to quantify both remembering and forgetting. So we wanted to quantify remembering and forgetting as two sort of distinct processes. And he also wanted to study the processes by which memories are forgotten over time, right? So really, the way that he did this was actually quite simple. So I want you to imagine, okay? I want you to think back to when you were an intro psych student, right? And arguably one of the most difficult things to learn as an intro psych student is anything to do with neuroscience. So I want you to think back to your early days as a Psych 101 student when you were trying to learn the parts of the neuron, right? So dendrites, cell body, things like that, and also how action potentials work, right? So that's a very daunting task, right? So let's say you listen to a lecture on the basics of neuroscience, and then that very night, you go to the library and study. Okay? So maybe you make some flashcards on Quizlet where you have like different words like dendrite, right? Dendrites are the branches coming off of the cell body that allow the neuron to communicate with other neurons, right? So you create a card in flashcards in Quizlet where you have a term relating to the anatomy of the neuron, and then on the other side, you have a definition, right? So you create all of your flashcards in Quizlet, and you basically run through all of your flashcards until you're able to recite all of the definitions from memory, right? So if you flash a card of a dendrite or a cell body or a synapse or whatever, you can recite each of those definitions from memory, right? And let's say the first night that you study in the library, that takes you about 90 minutes to run through everything so that you've learned it, right? So one of the ways that Ebbinghaus quantified what we remember is he looked at learning, initial learning, compared to relearning, right? So going off of the same example, right? Let's say the next night you decide to be extra studious. So you take your Quizlet, you again go to the library, and you run through all of your flashcards. And this time, instead of it taking you 90 minutes to learn them all to complete accuracy, right? It only takes you 45 minutes, right? So that reduction in the time it takes you to learn it again is in essence a quantifiable index of what you know, right? So basically, your first night of studying, right, where it took you 90 minutes, right? The amount of time you saved the second time, right? So the first night it took you 90 minutes, and then the second night it only took you 45, right? If we subtract 90 from 45 or 45 from 90, that means in essence that you have saved yourself 45 minutes of study time. So that 45 minutes of study time is in essence a quantifiable index of what you know, right? So that's a way of measuring what you remember, right? Now let's continue with this example and say on the third night, you meant to go to the library and review your Quizlet cards, right? But maybe a friend was having a birthday party, or maybe you had to clean your room or do something else for another class. So that third night, you don't study your Quizlet, okay? But 24 hours later, you go back to it, right? So this time, instead of saving yourself 45 minutes, right? Instead of it taking you 45 minutes to learn your Quizlet, it now takes you 60 minutes, right? So the difference between your best time of 45 minutes and your current time after not studying for one day, right, in essence is a quantifiable index of forgetting. Okay? So I'll go through this again, but I just want you to keep that in mind. Okay. So Ebbinghaus conducted his first memory experiment in 1885. And unlike modern experimentation, where we recruit, anywhere from 20 to 200 Psych 101 students and have them complete a memory task, Ebbinghaus decided to use himself as his only participant, right? So what he did is he created a list of 3-letter nonsense syllables, okay? So these lists were of things like dax and lem, right? And ticks, and basically nonsense syllables that had no prior meaning associated with them, right? So think to yourself, why would he create these nonsense syllables instead of using regular German words? Well, he wanted the purest measure of learning, right? So the problem with using, words or pictures or whatever as your stimuli is that you have prior experiences with that information, right? So you've already learned what a boat is or what a, house is. And so those associations have already been made in your memory, right? So if you want to really scientifically study memory, you have to have totally novel stimuli that don't have those prior associations. So that's why he created these nonsense syllables. And basically, we didn't have computers in 1885, so he created an experimental apparatus called a memory drum. And so basically, this drum would flip through this list of nonsense syllables and he would study them, right? So he would view a series of nonsense syllables in this kind of spinning cylinder, and he would repeat until he could predict what the next syllables in the list were. So he would work on it until he could recite from memory in order this list of nonsense syllables. And then after a delay of either a few minutes or several days, he would look to see how long it took him to relearn that list. Okay, so let's look at this more closely. Okay, so again, his measure of remembering was a subtraction of two components. So to measure what he knows or to measure what he remembers, he would take the time it took him to originally learn the list and subtract from that the time it took him to relearn the list after some delay or after some prescribed passage of time. And that was evidence of remembering. Okay? And then to look at forgetting, he would see the change in the savings score as the delay got longer. So let's look at this on a graph. Okay, so I apologize, the graph is cut off a little bit. But as you can see on the blue bar, when Ebbinghaus first went through the list, okay, of nonsense syllables, it took him 1,000 seconds to learn the whole list until he could recite it perfectly. So his original time to learn the list is 1,000 seconds, right? And then 19 minutes later, as you can see on the x-axis, it only took him 400 seconds to relearn the list, right? So in essence, his savings, right, which is again a measure of what he remembers, was 600 seconds, okay? So he's saving himself 600 seconds. The initial learning period saved him 600 seconds when he tried to relearn the information. But look what happens as the delay increases from 19 minutes to 24 hours, okay? Suddenly, instead of it taking him just 400 seconds to learn the list, it now takes him 650 seconds to learn the list, right? And as we move from 1 day to 6 days, instead of it taking him 650 seconds to relearn the list, it now takes him 730 seconds. Okay? So again, the savings score tells us what he knows, but the reduction in savings across a time delay, okay, shows the rate of forgetting. So one of the things that Ebbinghaus noted when he plotted all of this is that originally, okay, or initially, when the delay increased, okay, there was quite a dramatic drop in savings. So there was a fast rate of forgetting, right? So initially, after 19 minutes, he um or excuse me, after 19 minutes, his savings of 600 was reduced by almost half, right? As he went from a 19-minute delay to a 24-hour delay. But eventually, the reduction in savings eventually leveled off, right? So we see that first big dip between 600 and 350, but the dip from 350 um, to um, to 730, right, is much reduced. Okay, so two critical insights there, right? Is number one, we can quantify both remembering and forgetting. And number two, as far as the time course of forgetting, initially we see a significant drop in savings, or we see a significant reduction in what we remember. But after a period of about, 6 days or whatever, right, that forgetting levels off. And in fact, they've done subsequent studies where they looked at, for example, adults' memory for Spanish words if they took Spanish in high school, right? So if you get in touch with people, 10 years after they graduate high school, and you test them on the, words and terms that they initially learned in high school, you'll see a very, very dramatic drop, right? So if you test a high school senior on their Spanish vocabulary, they'll probably get about words correct about 85% of the time, or 90%, especially if it's recent. But then if you test them on that same vocabulary, right, 10 years later, right, there's going to be evidence for a lot of forgetting. So maybe their, Spanish a fluency score is like 85, 90% in high school, but then 10 years later it falls to like 45%, right? So that's a big drop. But if you test them after that initial 10-year period, maybe every year or every other year, what you'll see is that what they learn or what they remembered after 10 years, they're generally able to recall after that. So after that initial significant reduction in memory, whatever you have left, you'll probably retain indefinitely, is essentially what that means. So now that we've talked about the experiments that Ebbinghaus conducted and how he quantified both remembering and forgetting, let's talk about his legacy and some of the reasons why he's considered the father of modern memory science. So some of the most important reasons is that he gave us a proper experimental methodology for investigating memory in a scientific and very precise methodological way. So his method of learning something and then relearning it over time gave us a way of quantifying things like forgetting and remembering. And he also investigated a number of different variables that are still used in memory experiments today. So in addition to plotting things like timing and the number of seconds, and retention interval, which is just the amount of time that's passed since the initial learning episode, he also varied the number of learning trials, which is basically the number of study episodes, and he looked at recall, so having people learn something and then basically respond with what they know, right, or what they remember, all of those things seem very basic, but they originated with Ebbinghaus. So, as I said before, um, Ebbinghaus was credited with plotting the time course of forgetting, right? So, he plotted the number of items people could remember as a function of the passage of time. And he found that even though initially after the first learning episode we have this massive savings, right? That savings um, initially drops off considerably as the amount of time increases, but eventually it levels off, right? So that's the forgetting curve or the time course of forgetting. Ebbinghaus also discovered a number of important memory phenomena that are validated today. So one example of these phenomena were the list length effect, right? And so basically Ebbinghaus discovered that he was better able to learn a list of 20 nonsense syllables than a list of 200 nonsense syllables, for good reason, right? Because the more items you have on a list, the more likely you are to confuse them or experience what we refer to as interference, which is one of the main causes of forgetting. He also looked at learning as a function of savings, right? So basically, the more learning episodes you have, or the more time you spend reviewing information, okay, the more of a savings you will get, or the less forgetting you will experience over time. Related to that, Ebbinghaus was the first experimental psychologist to demonstrate that forgetting decreases as a function of overlearning. So, overlearning is simply the practice of continuing to study something even though you have perfect recall, right? So, for example, my mom is a really big fan of poetry. And so, when she was a teenager, she would practice memorizing her favorite poems and she would recite this list of poems every day before she went to bed. And she started this at the age of 13 and is now 63. And she can recite all of these poems from memory, even though she started the process long ago. Right? And that's because she recited them all, even though she had perfect accuracy already, over and over and over again. Right? So overlearning is just continuing to study something, even though you already have perfect mastery over it. And essentially, what that will do is it will dramatically reduce the rate of forgetting over time. Another really critical memory principle that we'll talk about is the spacing effect or the distributed practice effect. And this originated with Ebbinghaus's research. So he found that when he widely distributed learning of the lists, so when he distributed the lists such that for some of them he would learn a list and then learn a bunch of other lists and then learn the list again. His subsequent recall and savings were increased compared to studying the same list over and over and over again. Right? So that's basically spacing out your study sessions over time versus cramming and having all of your study sessions kind of lumped together. Right? And Ebbinghaus was the first to demonstrate that your long term retention of information is better when you distribute your learning sessions, right? So that's something we'll talk about, but again, that's a very well-known kind of principle of memory that spacing out or distributing your learning sessions is better than cramming or doing all of your learning together in time. And that's something that originated with Ebbinghaus. So in the United States, researchers focused on expanding the work of Ebbinghaus and examined learning and memory for nonsense syllables or words. So, because the research focused on memory for lexical items like words and nonsense syllables, it is typically referred to as the verbal learning tradition. So the verbal learning tradition was heavily influenced by the emergence of behaviorism in the early part of the 20th century. So during the behaviorist era, the majority of psychological research focused on observable changes in behavior brought about by experience, right? So prominent behaviorist researchers in the United States included Edward Tolman, Edward Thorndike, John Watson, and B.F. Skinner. And all of these researchers were interested in the observable aspects of learning, such as how the consequences of behavior influenced subsequent behavior, right? So, in the case of something like operant conditioning, right? So, eliciting a behavior and then a consequence, right? But in the interest of parsimony, they weren't comfortable making assumptions about inner, sort of unobservable mechanisms that may be related to behavior. So, researchers supporting behaviorism were in positions of great power during this time, and it was nearly impossible to get funding for research, publish journal articles, or teach courses that contradicted behaviorist principles. And so, because of this dominant behaviorist tradition, memory research during this era revolved around predicting memory related behaviors, such as recall and recognition, that might vary across conditions, right? So, no real attempts were made to model, for example, the cognitive structures that made memory possible because behaviorists were really strict empiricists, right? So, if something could not be directly observed, no conclusions about how it operated could be made, right? So, the methodological rigor that was developed during the behaviorist era, in order for behaviorists to conclude with confidence that an observed change in behavior was the result of experimental manipulation, helped legitimize psychology, particularly in the realm of science, and remains a crucial element of the quality of memory research today, right? So, so some of the things that we could study as memory researchers during this time included basic stimulus response associations, right? So that might include having people learn associates, word associates, right? So if we show a participant car dash green, right? Um, and then we give them the cue car, okay? We would see under which conditions they're able to recall the associated word green. And generally speaking, more frequent pairings or trials in which the participant sees car green, the more likely they are to recall the correct word. They also looked a lot at forgetting, right? So, theories of forgetting during this behaviorist tradition include the idea of decay. So, whenever you forget a word or a concept, it's because of a weakening of connections between that word and whatever the retrieval cue is, right? So, for example, the word green is associated with the word car, but you could also have more organic or intrinsic associations, right? So, for example, a particular environment might prompt a given memory, right? So, for example, this works a lot with fear conditioning, right? So, if you were For example, in a doctor's office, when you had a really painful procedure, right? Being in that same doctor's office might evoke memories, episodic memories of that procedure and kind of the resultant fear response. And so a way to get rid of that fear might be to weaken the connection between that environment and your distressing memories. Memory researchers during this time talked about stimulus generalization, right? So as your context that was initially a retrieval cue changes, you have poorer memory of that associated thing, right? And early behaviorists also talked about interference. So, for example, if one memory cue, so for example, if the word car gets associated with both the word green and the word Chevrolet, okay, those associations are going to kind of compete with each other for awareness. And it's going to be harder to remember the correct associate if there are multiple associations with the same cue. While behaviorism dominated psychology in the United States and Canada during the first half of the 20th century, the Gestalt approach, led by people like Wertheimer and Kafka and Kohler, dominated research in Germany. And so I think what is most synonymous for most people with the Gestalt approach is the phrase, the sum is greater, or the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And, and this becomes relevant for memory research in particular because unlike the verbal learning approach that dominated the behaviorist tradition, the Gestalt tradition emphasized more the study of internal representations and how those internal representations interacted with our perceptual or sensory experience. But we won't talk as much about the Gestalt approach as we will other kind of early traditions like the empiricist tradition and some aspects, believe it or not, of the behaviorist approach as well. So, one of the most influential memory researchers was a man by the name of Frederick Bartlett. So, Frederick Bartlett was the first professor of experimental psychology at the University of Cambridge in England. So, in the 1930s, Bartlett discovered that learners often only actually recalled small parts of the material that they've learned and then fill in the missing pieces based on general knowledge about the subject. So Bartlett hypothesized that people were guided by schemas. So schemas contain knowledge about what to expect in a given situation. So, for example, a person who was at a wedding may only really remember the bride, the groom, and the date, but may be able to reconstruct the event using their schema for what typically happens at a wedding, and may also remember a church, flowers, and vows based on that schema, but not actually and that might not be in a correct recollection. So, some of Bartlett's most compelling work showed the effect of culture on people's ability to remember stories. So, in his most famous study, Bartlett had British participants read a Canadian Indigenous folklore story called The War of the Ghosts, imploring them to remember as many details as possible. He then tested participants' recall for parts of the story at various intervals of time, and he found that when elements of the story didn't match the schema prescribed by British culture, the reader would exchange an element in the story for something more familiar. So, for example, participants who were not familiar with canoes recalled people riding in boats because British participants had an existing schema for riding in boats, but not for riding in canoes. So, research on schemas grew in popularity worldwide and actually informed a lot of our current understanding, particularly in the early 1970s, of how memory is reconstructive, which is something that we'll talk more about in the next module. One of the most important events in the history of memory science was something called the cognitive revolution. So, recall from earlier when we were talking about the behaviorist era, right? This behaviorist era dominated psychology for almost 40 or 50 years. And behaviorists expressly said that you can't scientifically study the mind. Instead, you have to restrict your research to observable behavior. So the cognitive revolution was the first attempt in many, many decades to actually go back to attempting to scientifically study the mind. And one of the most important um, uh, causes of the cognitive revolution was the advent of the digital computer. So the first digital computers developed in the late 1940s were these gigantic machines that took up entire buildings. In 1954, however, IBM introduced a computer that was made available to the general public, and most commonly found in universities, where they were used to analyze data, and they also suggested new ways of thinking about the mind. And in the late 1950s, along with the introduction of the digital computer, a number of events ended that behaviorist era. So, first, there were a small but vocal group of researchers that called into question a lot of the behaviorist explanations of cognitive or cognitive concepts or things related to the mind. So, one example is language acquisition, right? So, the behaviorist view of how children acquire language is that they do so via operant conditioning, right? So, a child just randomly makes noises until it just by happenstance says the word mama, right? And all of a sudden the parents are ecstatic and they start to praise the child and just show a lot of excitement, right? So essentially the child learns to speak because when he pronounces the correct sounds for a particular word, he's met with a very positive and rewarding consequence in the form of praise and recognition, right? So a linguist by the name of Noam Chomsky basically pointed out that there's no way that children can become totally fluent in their native language by the age of 6 simply through kind of trial and error, right? So the behaviorist explanation for language acquisition and a number of other phenomena in psychology simply wasn't sufficient. And so that's one of the things, in addition to the advent of the computer, that led to the sort of resurgence of research studying the mind in particular. And so basically, psychologists started to use the computer as a metaphor for how memory and other mental processes work. And this metaphor of the computer, or using the computer as a metaphor for the mind, became known as the information processing approach. the information processing approach. And so a lot of the most influential models of memory that came out of the 1950s were information processing models that essentially posited that the mind worked like a digital computer. And so that's where a lot of our early um, conceptions of how memory worked were formed. So we've already distinguished between learning as the behaviors or actions that you implement when trying to acquire information, and memory, which is essentially the record or evidence or artifacts of those learning processes. Now let's talk a little bit about different types of memory. So we have short-term memory, which simply refers to the memories that a person is currently aware of, right? So short-term memory, or primary memory as it's sometimes called, is basically the contents of your consciousness, right? So what you're currently aware of and thinking about, whereas long-term memory refers to all of the different acquired memories that a person could bring to consciousness if they want to. So, for example, when reading a book or reading this slide or listening to this lecture, your short-term memory is comprised of an individual sentence that you just read or listened to, whereas the meaning of the words that comprise that sentence, or the inflection of my voice, right? Those would all be things that come from long-term memory that you can ultimately pull into your short-term memory or your current consciousness, right? So one more thing I'll say about short-term memory is short-term memory is actually kind of an outdated term. So short-term or primary memory was our earliest conception of memory of consciousness, right? But short-term memory or primary memory implies that all that we're doing, right, with that current state of consciousness is we're holding on to information, but we're not actually doing anything with it, right? But it turns out that this immediate consciousness type of memory is comprised not only of storing or holding on to information, but also manipulating it in some way. So, for example, instead of simply being able to hold the numbers 5 and 20 in our consciousness, we can do things like mental arithmetic. So we can say 20 plus 5 is 25, 20 times 5 is 100, right? So that's really, in essence, more of a dynamic process of consciousness. So holding things in mind and also manipulating them in some way. So the term that we use for both storage and manipulation of information we're currently thinking about is working memory, not short-term memory. But we'll talk more about those sort of nuances later in the course. So as I mentioned previously, there are a lot of different distinctions we can make between different types of memory. So one of the most important distinctions is between implicit and explicit memory, right? So explicit or declarative memories are memories that include conscious or intentional recall, right? So basically, the way that explicit memories are acquired is through effortful learning. So, we can further distinguish explicit or declarative memories into either semantic or episodic memories. So semantic memories are explicit memories that reference facts and definitions or general knowledge about the world. right? So semantic memories, we can see how it would require effort to acquire that information, right? Or to learn that information, right? Episodic memories are explicit memories that relate to our personal experience or events in our life. And generally speaking, the neural substrates, right, where explicit memories are formed, are critical areas such as the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex, and also the hippocampus and the limbic system. In contrast, implicit memories are a little bit different. So, implicit memories or non-declarative memories are those that are acquired automatically or without effort or conscious recall. So, one type of implicit memory is procedural memories. So, a lot of times, procedural memories refer to motor skills or simply knowledge of how to do things, right? So, for example, a lot of times we do things so often, right? Like tying your shoes or opening a doorknob, right? That we don't even think about how they're done, right? So that's an example of a procedural memory. And also emotion, right? Some kinds of emotional responses can be implicit as well. So, for example, classically conditioned responses, right? So, for example, perhaps you have a fear of needles, right? So, every time you see a needle or hear the word needle, you have an emotional response of fear. Or maybe if you see a picture of a snake, you have an implicit sort of fear of being bitten by the snake. So any sort of fear conditioning would fall under implicit as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about this distinction in a little bit, but I do want to sort of talk a little bit more about this distinction. So the division between explicit and implicit memory is based on the fact that there's two neural circuits that have formed over the course of human evolution. So the first neural circuit is called the implicit memory system. So as animals evolved the ability to move, being able to change behavior based on experiences within the environment presented a significant survival advantage. So, for example, an animal that remembered feeling threatened in a particular location would have been more likely to survive and reproduce than an animal that could not remember being threatened and subsequently fell prey to that threat, for example, at a later date. Similarly, an animal that could form memories of how to perform new actions, which would fall under procedural memory, would have a survival advantage over an animal that could not form these types of memories. So this type of memory is referred to as implicit memory because it functions outside of awareness, right? So implicit memory is necessarily independent of conscious experience because it evolved long before consciousness, but was retained after consciousness evolved because implicit memory still has survival value, right? So the implicit memory system stores and retrieves information exclusively based on sensory input and primarily uses parts of the brain that appeared early in animal evolution. So because of how it evolved, the neural circuit involved in implicit memory doesn't typically interface with the parts of the brain that gave rise to conscious awareness. So the second neural circuit, and by the way, the neural circuit of implicit memory is, among others, the cerebellum and also the basal ganglia, right? So the second neural circuit is the explicit memory system. So many researchers argue that explicit memory evolved when, at some point in evolutionary history, some animals developed the ability to form mental representations of their environment. This mental representation, which we now refer to as consciousness, was used to guide the animal's actions and gave the animal a survival advantage, particularly in complex ecological environments. So, supporters of this view suggest that a new type of memory evolved to be integrated into conscious experience. So the existing implicit memory system could not serve this purpose because it takes information from the senses and stores it and then retrieves information based on matching sensory experience. The new memory system, in contrast, needed to be under conscious control, as it needed to be possible to intentionally retrieve information in response to one's changing environment. Thus, animals with consciousness evolved a neural circuit that started and ended with conscious experience. An animal could now deliberately recall information and have that information integrated into consciousness, right? The explicit memory system is responsible for all memory within awareness, including short-term memory or consciousness and deliberate memory recall. Because the neural circuits for explicit and implicit memory are independent, okay, that speaks to the nature of a lot of our different memory systems. So they're independent, they're separate neural circuits for both explicit and independent and implicit memory that operate independently of each other. Right? And so therefore they can be considered different types of memory. So there's a lot of research that we'll talk about that demonstrates the dissociation between implicit and explicit memory. So we'll talk more about this when we get to the neuroscience module. So by 1975 or so, there were dozens of well-replicated models of memory that could explain, for example, the different types. So we had models for sensory memory, for short-term memory, for working memory, for semantic memory, for episodic memory, for autobiographical memory, for implicit and visual memory, right? And we'll talk about all those different types of memory and what they mean later on in the course. However, around 1978, a renowned psychologist by the name of Ulrich Neisser questioned the ecological validity of some of these models that were constructed by studying typical people, primarily in a laboratory context, because those people had to complete these kind of artificial laboratory tasks in laboratory settings. And so Ulrich Neisser basically said that none of these results could be applied to the real world. So Neisser's opinion was very influential and thus began a frenzy of research in ecologically valid or applied settings. So researchers, for example, began to study everything from how memory operated in different aspects of everyday life. So of both typical individuals and individuals with cognitive disorders. They also began to research exceptional memory. So, for example, investigating how was it that actors could remember um, thousands and thousands of lines of prose, how musicians, for example, learned music, how taxi drivers, especially in the UK and Europe, could remember the routes to endless locations around huge cities, and how some people could learn long sequences of numbers, such as the first 80 digits of pi or something like that. Um, so, for the first time, researchers also examined autobiographical memory, or one's memory of one's own life, and learned how the sense of self is intimately connected with memory. Um, and so, for example, researchers found that one's self concept or identity is based on one's memory, and one's memory is biased by one's own self concept. So, what was astounding and somewhat reassuring was that despite thousands of research studies on implied memory, time and time again, researchers found the same patterns that they had established in the lab. Thus, the models of memory constructed in controlled settings could be used to explain memory and behavior in the real world. So ultimately, unlike Ulrich Neisser's initial contention, right, both laboratory experiments and more ecologically valid real world experiments can kind of complement each other and reveal unique differences and similarities that all sort of center around different principles of memory. So, the last thing I wanted to mention in this lecture is the fact that one of the principal ways that psychologists and great thinkers have attempted to understand memory is by positing different metaphors. So there was a wonderful paper published by Henry Roediger, who is one of the most influential memory theorists of our time, talking about all of the metaphors that have been posited for memory over the years, dating all the way back to philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. So, one of the characteristics of memory that's illuminated by these metaphors is that memory is not passive. So, some metaphors capture the fact that memory has a lot of dynamic characteristics. So, for example, the process of retrieving one memory from the chaotic jumble, right, that we've all accumulated over our history in all of our experiences has led to the idea that searching for memories is like trying to catch birds in an aviary. So, this is one of the metaphors posited by Aristotle. So, a good metaphor for how chaotic and jumbled memory retrieval can sometimes be is trying to catch a particular bird in an aviary or a giant cage full of birds, right? So, um, sometimes you hold out your hand and call out to a specific bird, and that specific bird flies into your hand, right? So, we would characterize that as a successful retrieval. Um, Other times you hold out your hand and call to a specific bird and you get a similar looking bird, right? So maybe the bird has the same color feathers and the same type of beak as the type of bird you're looking for, but isn't the correct one, right? So that's where we have an instance of retrieval failure. Maybe we um, are want to say a specific bird or a specific word, right? So instead of saying table, we say chair, right? So those are similar words, but they convey different meanings, right? And sometimes we call for a bird and no bird comes to our outstretched hand, right? So that's outright retrieval failure where we can't access something that we know resides in our memory, right? So that kind of illustrates again how chaotic and dynamic memory retrieval can be. Another metaphor that kind of captures this is memory is a junk drawer or even a garbage can, right? So memory retrieval is very fraught and vulnerable to memory failure, right? So that's one of the main causes of forgetting. Um, so this also goes along with the idea that memories are harder to get at over time, as if they're being led away on a conveyor belt, right? So memory is a conveyor belt because memory is inherently transient, right? Or time sensitive in nature. And memories, depending upon how you encode them or the learning strategies that you adopt, can be very difficult to recall. So often, some kind of search is required to find memories that meet a current need, like a lock into a key, right? Or a tuning fork resonating with a note, right? Or some notes, but not other notes. Um, so memory retrieval is further complicated by the fact that much of what is stored in memory is forgotten, leaving open leaving only a proportion of the original, like water in a leaky bucket, right? That's another metaphor. Water in a leaky bucket or a cow's stomach, right? So the point of this really is that memory is so dynamic, right? That there are multiple metaphors that can speak to its features, right? So another way of thinking about memory is it's reconstructive, right? Memory is reconstructive rather than being photographic, right? So every time we attempt to retrieve a memory, that memory is altered, right? And changed in some way. So it's kind of memory is kind of like reconstructing a dinosaur from fragments of bones left behind or fossils, right? And there's also an active manipulation component of memory. We actively manipulate information as if memory were a workbench or a computer, right? So all of these metaphors of memory speak to some of its components, right? And you'll see that a lot of our insights from memory come from applying these specific metaphors. Okay, so that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you have a wonderful day.